So in thinking of this workshop, I went through lots and lots of different iterations of what to talk about, trying to figure out what would be the most helpful topic, what will help people walk away from this um, better able to be a good trans ally and supportive of those in their lives. And that is a huge, huge topic. What I eventually settled on is I think the best way to get this point across is to share stories. These aren't all my stories, but I do have permission to share them. I didn't want it to turn into Samantha's pity party because I wanted to share good experiences and bad experiences, and mine have been pretty negative. So to start off, I want to share two stories of people I know. Two trans people, a trans man and a trans woman. They don't know each other as far as I know. And the first is a trans man, member of the LDS Church still, or was at the time this happened, needed to have a trans-related surgery. And his ward rallied behind him. The Relief Society arranged for meals to be prepared, help with housework, somebody to, I believe, even pick him up at the hospital and help him out through his recovery. And then on the other hand, we have a young trans woman who is a friend of mine. Her parents are also LDS. She is not. And they have been very, very unsupportive. She recently had surgery as well to correct an earlier surgery, got a post-op infection. And so she called her mom one day. She was completely delirious, had a really, really high temperature, and was scared and alone. Her roommates are also very, to put it politely, very orthodox LDS. And the response she got from her mother when she called to ask for help was, "That's what you get." And so, and this is hard for me to even really fathom as a mother myself, to have a child in agony like that, crying for help and reject them. And so the big question is, what causes this difference in attitudes? What makes one ward or one parent accept a transgender member of their family and others complete and utter rejection like that? And I have some ideas about why it happens. And again, this is meant to involve audience participation, so please chime in if you can. Does anybody I know we have some parents of trans kids in here. Any ideas for what the difference is in those attitudes?
Yeah, I'd like to maybe comment on that. My name is Wade, and I'm the parent of a transgender daughter. And she came out when she was 9. And I think what was the biggest difference for us was kind of our initial outreach to the bishop of our ward. I mean, we're in the Bay Area, and so there's different, it's, I wouldn't say it's a luxury, but it's a little bit more easy, I think, to come out in this sort of a situation. But the church is still the church, and the way that our bishop responded really set the tone for the entire transition. He was really supportive and excited, and more than anything, a great support to us as a family, and that made the difference, going forward. I think, he brought it up in our ward council, who they're not all, kind of your stereotypical Bay Area folks that are voting on the left side of the ticket all the time. Some of them are donors of of policies that seem counter to what we'd expect. But even then, because the bishop set the standard, we developed a strategy for how she would come out at church, and we kind of identified folks that it might be really problematic for, and kind of created, I went over to those homes with the members of the bishopric that had the best relationships, and we talked about that, and we made it a safe space for those that we were maybe most concerned about. And then also working with our primary president, developed a plan to reach out to all the families of the kids in her class, as well as others that would be concerned. And it was a lot of work, but the experience was positive. We don't know, it will obviously change as she gets older and realizes that the church's stance is not quite as welcoming as her experience was, and hopefully we'll be prepared for those conversations. And even our own kind of involvement in church is still, we're precarious, and so I don't know if that helps, but our experience has been very positive, to be sure.
What do you think led that bishop to be so accepting and helpful, though?
I think we got lucky. First of all, I think it's something we didn't know. We kind of, he'd worked on a few, Republican presidential campaigns and other things that we kind of thought like, oh, this isn't going to go well. We just sort of, but realistically, he ended up being very. I think he had thought about it a lot. Our ward, we have a lot of gay members that vary in various levels of activity, and so it's something that was kind of on the forefront of his mind, and he didn't have to think about how his response was. His response was love first, and I don't know if there was any. I wish there was a way that you could coach other leaders to be like that. And hopefully he will, hopefully more of them get together and realize that that the response of love is most productive.
I think that is the big thing. You hit the nail on the head, is that we see some leaders that have the attitude of love first, and even with the very problematic love the sinner, hate the sin attitude, you can still work around that with love. And first of all, being trans is not a sin, just to clarify. And just out of curiosity, was that before they changed the handbook or after?
Mostly before, but a lot of it was during, and so that was very exciting to be in that time period. But yeah, it started before.
See, that's great, because a lot of people, even now getting the changes, have let that hurt their testimony that they now have to accept trans members. And so to see leaders who did it before, those were the good ones. That's impressive. So I think, Wade hit the nail on the head, like I said, that it's an attitude of loving first. And that's what makes the big difference. A lot of people, especially in our church, get really, really strict with not just the doctrine, but what they think the doctrine is. A really good example is that the family proclamation is often weaponized against everybody under the LGBTQ plus umbrella, but especially trans folks. And my biggest opinion on that is the proclamation is not canon. It's never been canonized. It's not doctrine. It's a nice piece of paper, kind of, for those who follow the more orthodox or conservative ideology, but it is not canon and it is not doctrine. And so when you weaponize that, you are looking beyond the mark and causing lots of harm with it. And somebody just commented that it's technically a legal document drafted by lawyers. Yes. Well, I shouldn't say that. Much of the quote unquote revelation that comes through the LDS Church these days runs through the offices of Kurt and McConkie before it runs through the offices of 12. And that's a problem. It's a really big problem. There are some church leaders who need to decide whether they would rather be a lawyer or a disciple of Christ because they stink at doing both. And so that's kind of where we run into that issue is people think the family proclamation is canon. They think that, especially it's been so long since I've read this thing, even though the 25-year anniversary was this week, about gender having eternal consequence, and that God created male and female. And and I'll stop for a second and say this is problematic for non-binary people, because there really are more genders than just strict male and female. But for somebody who's very binary trans like myself, that was never problematic for me. The church wants to say that a doctor with no priesthood authority or ability to get revelation for us made a split-second judgment and now knows what gender you are, and that somehow matches up with whatever your eternal gender is. And that's a bit of an issue, because if gender is eternal and is important in the eternities, then who better to decide what that gender is than the individual and God? But we often have stories of transgender members receiving that personal revelation, myself included, and then being summarily rejected by their leaders, who think they know better. One of the other big objections that I see a lot is people who think that associating with a transgender member will chase the spirit away. So a good example, I have a friend who is a piano technician. And prior to transition, she had a lot of contracts with the church here in Utah to tune and repair the pianos in stake centers and institute buildings and seminary buildings, and was quite well known in that respect. And she does still have some of her contracts with the church. But she's lost a lot of clients. Leaders who let her into a building to tune a piano and then complain. Or she's had people who've been clients for years say, we're not comfortable having you in our home because you will chase the spirit out. And so it's become an economic issue for her because she's losing clients over it. And, it reminds me of my favorite Bible story where Jesus was traveling through Samaria and he sat down at a well to rest when a Samaritan woman approached. And that's when he noticed that some Samaritans had been drinking out of this well, and he got disgusted and he left and he didn't get a drink out of it, right? Is that how that story turned out? No, he sat with her and he talked to her. So even if being trans was a sin, is casting people out the right thing to do? Did when the Pharisees brought the woman taken in adultery to Jesus and asked what they should do, he immediately said, looked right at her and said, "This is what you get for sinning," right? And then walked away and let them stone her. It's not how that one worked either. Um, that's it's not an excuse, even if you think it is sinning. Um, that's not how we're supposed to treat people who are outsiders or who are. Um, sorry, I keep reading things in the chat and it distracts me for a second. That's not how you treat somebody who is quote unquote falling away. And again, being transgender is not a sin. But if you're trying to save somebody, that is not how you do it. We've seen, there's another young trans woman who, give you another contrasting story. A friend of mine who is also a parent of a trans kid, when she initially went to her bishop, the bishop said, do whatever you need to keep him here, to keep him alive. It's better to have a trans son than a dead daughter. To contrast, here in Orem, and I used to work with this man, and when he went to his bishop, the story he got was the opposite. It's better to have a dead son than a trans daughter. And so he took this as justification to quite literally attempt to beat the hell out of his child. And you'd think that's a rarity, but it's really not. In working with the trans community here in Utah and the younger kids, that physical abuse becomes a very big part of it. There's another, this same trans woman who had, whose mother would not help her when she had her post-op infection. She's had times where she was $100 short on rent and facing eviction. And she would have been homeless because, one, her parents weren't going to give her $100 for rent. And two, she was not welcome in their home. Again, to go back to one of my favorite Bible stories, when the prodigal son came home and his parents says, no, we can't have you chasing the spirit out of our home and influencing your brothers and sisters. So I'm sorry, but this is your own fault. You need to figure it out. This is not the way it works. And so I think the attitude really comes down to, like what Wade said, it's about choosing love first. We've seen leaders who, even prior to the handbook changes, which are a step in the right direction, but still incredibly problematic, we saw leaders who chose love first and worked within the rules where their hands were tied to love first. And then we saw leaders who chose to use those rules instead as a bludgeon and expand them. And even though being trans before the handbook changes wasn't really an excommunicable offense, you would find leaders who chose to make it one. They would tell people to not transition, and then when they did anyway, they called it apostasy and would excommunicate. But then we'd also have people who would work around those rules, who Relief Society president, for example, prior to this change, people who were transitioning could not attend the third hour classes, which is now second hour, Priesthood and Relief Society. And so I know of at least one Relief Society president who said, well, you're not allowed to come in because the bishop won't let you, but we're going to leave the door open and you can sit in the hall, or we'll have somebody take notes for you. And then they continued to include her in social activities. She wasn't allowed to attend third hour at church, but she can come to enrichment or whatever we're calling it this day or these days. You could assign a ministering couple instead of home teachers. There were ways they worked around the rules to include first. Another friend of mine who attempted to go to Relief Society had the stake president go in and forcibly remove her from the building when she did that. causing a huge disturbance when he did so, because she was disturbing Relief Society by being there. And so you can see that it all comes down to this attitude of loving first. I had an experience with a good friend of mine. It was not safe for me to attend my home ward, and I've since left the church. I'm done with it. And I can talk about that more later with people if they're interested in that decision process. But when I would go to her ward with her, she straight up said, if you can't come to Relief Society, I'm not going either. And I know other trans sisters who have experienced that, or who've had a priesthood holder sit with a trans man in the foyer and say, if you can't go to priesthood, I'm not going either. Another big, well, I'll stop there for a second. Is there anybody who has questions, comments? This isn't supposed to just be the Samantha show, so people are welcome to chime in.
I don't have anything specific to say. I just am listening and absorbing and appreciate everything you're sharing with us. So.
Oh, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll just keep moving then. Another big objection I see. Oh, someone brought up a really good point. Asked in the comments, does the church forcibly remove men who attend Relief Society? No, actually. In fact, there's typically a member of the bishopric there, at least. And again, I haven't been to church for 2 years now, so things may have changed. But no, typically a member of the male leadership always sits in the Relief Society. But the second in the church's opinion that a man decides he's a woman, which is really offensive to phrase things that way. So please, I'm quoting here, that is not the way I think. Then that quote unquote man is no longer welcome in Relief Society. And so that is a really, really good point. That it's kind of a double standard there. You know, we'll let certain men attend Relief Society, but not others. And so we definitely do see that double standard a little bit. Even now, what's interesting about the new policies is they came out like 3 weeks before we stopped having in-person church. And so we haven't really gotten to see how a lot of wards are going to interpret things. You know, now it's explicitly allowed for trans people to attend the meeting of their choice, and they're supposed to be accepted. But then there's also a rule about if people's dress and grooming standards cause a disturbance, then they may be asked not to attend meetings. And so one of the big concerns in the transgender community is that people will interpret that as you can identify as transgender, but the second you dress as your identified gender, your dress and grooming is causing a disturbance and we can kick you out. And so again, it all comes down to the attitude of the leader. If their attitude is love first, then we see a very different response. You know, interpreting the rules in a way that allow inclusion versus interpreting them in ways that move towards exclusion. And then I see we have somebody new who jumped in. Just to let you know, they are recording the session, but it is supposed to be question and answer. So you're welcome to send questions to me in the chat if you would like me to respond to those and you don't want to chime in on camera, so to speak. And even within those policies, so I have a short list here. These aren't interesting stories. But when I asked in a group for transgender church members, some of the ways they felt included at church. One mentioned that a big one was, again, back when we weren't allowed to attend third hour, having people sit in the foyer with them instead. That happened to me a couple times. I more or less stopped attending right when I came back for a little while, and then found out my children were being bullied in primary, and that's when I stopped entirely. But for that short, probably 6 weeks when I had come out to the ward and hadn't even started transitioning yet, I did have a couple people who I had a little kid at the time, so I would hang out in the foyer anyway as my excuse. And but I did have a few people come hang out with me, which meant a lot at the time. Another sister brought up that when the new policies were announced and she was crying after church, she had another sister brought her a box of tissues, and that meant the world to her. Somebody else mentioned a bishop who called her sister instead of insisting on calling her brother, even though she had transitioned. Using the right pronouns is huge. The church now has explicitly said that we can put those in people's membership records, what their preferred name and preferred pronouns are, which is an improvement. Again, it's a step in the right direction, but we're still missing the mark a little bit. So, inclusion and love is always going to be the right answer. A lot of people, another objection I hear is people just aren't sure what to say or do. This is new for them. And I think that's part of why, Wade, you had a good experience in your ward, is you weren't the first. And so the bishop had already been exposed to people who were LGBTQ, had already had experience, maybe if not with transgender members, but with people who didn't fit the mold of what the church says we're supposed to be, and was therefore more flexible and willing to choose love first. And if you are afraid of offending, understand that most of us would love to talk about our experiences. There are a few strong, what's the word? There are a few lines you shouldn't cross with questions. One of which is discussions of plumbing configurations or the undercarriage are typically always off base. Unless you think you're about to become a sexual partner of that person, it's none of your business. But up to and including that, most of us are more than willing to answer questions. If you're confused, if you don't know, if you aren't sure what the transgender experience is like, ask. Let the trans person lead the discussion, and be willing to back off if they seem uncomfortable. But most of us will welcome people asking. Anytime you don't know how to handle it, again, erring on the side of love or inclusion is always going to be the right answer. To share some other good experiences, another trans woman who I know is very active in the tennis community. So outside of church now, talking about community, and has been accepted by the other girls on her team. She's one of them, and there's no question in that. And her team captain has gone to bat for her when she's had issues. Those who are familiar with the transgender discussion know that trans women participation in sports is a huge hot topic right now. And, there are potentially some advantages in certain sports, but the only advantages I have, for example, have to do with my height, which can be an advantage in basketball or rowing, for example. But I know women who are taller than me, who are cis women, who are way better at it than I am. So it's really just another excuse to persecute trans people. It's one of the last places where people try to use biology as a reason to exclude. And she's just been accepted by her team. And she occasionally has issues with members of other teams. But in general, has been accepted. For me, even though my family and my church completely rejected me, in my business and professional life, I have not had an issue. When I was I used to do a lot of networking and attend lots of networking lunches. And when I transitioned, nobody batted an eye at it. There was, my favorite one is I went to, I think it was the Sandy Area Chamber of Commerce, one of their events. And if you need an example for the perfect way to approach somebody's transition, this is it. He just kept talking to me like nothing had ever happened, like nothing was different. And then at some point in the conversation, he says, "Oh, by the way, what should I call you now?" I told him and we moved on. And that was it. There was no reaction. There was no surprise. There was nothing, and, I had a few other people mention it, but never went any further than that. But honestly, that's the right way to approach it. It's only awkward if you make it awkward. And trust me, we are so used to dealing with awkwardness that we're mostly immune to it at this point, once you get to a certain stage in your transition. And so it's typically the cis people who are making it awkward. Just talk. Just, it's the same person. We didn't stop being who we were. Didn't stop being your friend or your son. Well, your child, to use a gender neutral term, or your ward member. We're still the same person. We are just expressing the parts of ourselves that we had to keep hidden. And there are some things that change, mostly appearance related, but you can just continue to have conversations, continue to invite people to events. There's this idea that, when you transition, somebody who is always super, well, that's a bad example. Somebody who was always super masculine just immediately now has to become this girly girl. No, I still work on my car. I know lots of trans women who do. I don't do it as often because now that I can afford to pay somebody to do it, it's never something I particularly enjoyed. But, I'm still the same person I was. Most of the trans people in your lives are still the same person they were. Just continue to include them. And let's see, do we have any other questions popping up before I start wrapping up? Go ahead.
Okay, you can tell me if this isn't the right format for this, but I have a question about being an ally to, so in this specific circumstance, my friend, she is a member of the church and she's super conservative, but she's been coming around to some more liberal ideas. But so she has a daughter who, her kids aren't members, she's the only member. And so my friend is the only member. Her daughters aren't members. One of her daughters has a transgender child who is in, I think, 3rd grade now. But they started the transition socially, saying that the child was, I forget if it's girl. I don't know her kids. So I think it was a female to male transition. I can't remember though. So they started that in the school like right away, kindergarten. And my friend has had a really, really hard time accepting that her daughter and her grandson would know that that's like a real thing. And I've tried to just listen, and I'm not exactly sure how to be a better ally than to just listen, or what to say. I've tried to share some things that I know, but I don't really know anything. Like, how young is too young to know was one of her questions, and that kind of stuff.
So the big question I'm hearing then is, she's wondering how a kid that young could find out.
Right. And she feels like her daughter has an investment in being socially cool by being a mom of a trans child who's okay with their child being trans, rather than believing her daughter could actually feel that way. I don't know how to explain it. Does that make any sense? Like,
No, it makes tons of sense. And that's a common thing that we hear, is that why is it so more common now than it used to be? And why, it's the media influence, because people think that this is acceptable now, they're all of a sudden deciding they're trans. And if you want
yeah,
to read some really horrible stuff, you can read about rapid onset gender dysphoria, which is a widely debunked theory that certain ideologues love to recite. The answer is that, first of all, being trans has always existed. You look at other cultures and we can see this going back hundreds, if not thousands of years. It wasn't called being transgender back then. But you have, in Native American cultures, or other indigenous peoples, the idea of two-spirit, which has been around forever. You have and I always pronounce this wrong, but in the East, you have the Hedras, for example, which have been around for a very, very long time. Western society became very, very gendered. Gosh, I don't know, sometime around the sometime between the Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation, we really started to see more division, between gender roles. And I'm not an expert on the historical aspect of it, but it has been around forever. So it's not that the media is making it more common, and that's why kids are making these choices earlier. It's that we're now less likely to, slightly less likely, to have our parents kick us out on the street. Conversion therapy is now illegal. I have friends who were in conversion therapy, who are my age, and it really messes people up. So the first answer is, it's just safer now. 10 years ago, well, 15 now, because I'm getting older, when I first got to a point where I was about to come out, rather than go on a mission, even then it wasn't very safe. You were very realistically, coming out meant rejection, homelessness, a life as a sex worker. Because, and you're kidding yourself if you don't think this still happens here in Utah. You want to talk about stopping child trafficking? Quit kicking your LGBTQ kids out of your house, because that's what they do to survive. Realistically, we see a huge push in Utah right now to, oh no, we have to stop child trafficking. It's this horrible thing. But these are the same parents that when their kid comes out of trans, they will kick them onto the street. And guess how they eat? How they get a roof over their head. And so it's just safer. It's not media influence or peer pressure. Somebody doesn't just wake up one day and decide, oh, I think changing my gender would be cool. It's a very innate part of us. I knew as young as 4 years old.
Okay, that was one of my questions, was going to be how young did you know that about yourself?
Yeah, I knew when I was 4. I didn't have a word for it. I didn't really understand it until my mom happened to be watching an episode of Oprah when I was like 7 or 8, and they were interviewing a transgender woman. And that's the first time I had a word for it. But I grew up in a family. My dad was an officer in the Marine Corps. He held a lot of high priesthood offices, and it was all about toxic masculinity. You know, I was the oldest kid, the oldest son. Um, and there was, it was not safe. I mean, I came out in my 30s, and my dad had mellowed out considerably. And his response to me coming out was still, I think suicide is the better option. Um, that's why people are coming out in their 30s and 40s and 50s, not because they suddenly figured it out in their 30s or 40s or 50s, because even as a 30-something-year-old, when I came out, I was still facing complete rejection and utter financial ruin. And I knew that. I knew it was going to happen. I almost killed myself over it. Um, and I was an adult whose brain had fully matured, who had some semblance of a safety net, who had the skills to recover financially, even though, you know, I lost a business I put 10 years into. I lost a marriage I put 10 years into. The church tried to help take my children away. These are all things I knew were going to happen, but I had the skills necessary to survive, to get help, to rebuild a new business from scratch, to make a career change. A 5-year-old doesn't have that. You know, if their parents are not accepting, they're going to end up on the street again as a sex worker.
Are there any resources I can point my friend to so that even though I don't know her grandchild, I want to be an ally for the grandchild and just help my friend kind of cultivate more compassion or understanding about it so she can have a good relationship with the grandchild. Right now she's cut off from a grandchild, which is probably the right thing
Yeah,
at the moment.
I speak to no one in my family except for my mother and 2 siblings um, for my mental health. And I can't imagine a kid that young having grandma reject him. And the best thing for her to do, and if she wants to be, so there's a handful of different groups out there. Affirmation's great. They do have a group for trans allies. It's not as active from what I've seen as some of the other ones out there. North Star has a group for family members of transgender people, and they lean a little bit more towards LDS orthodoxy. And so it's an easier sell typically. I eventually left that group myself just because it was too orthodox and I was being censored. You know, when some of us expressed hurt over some things church leaders were doing, rather than allowing discussion of that hurt, they censored it. And so not my favorite group, but for people who are still very orthodox leaning LDS, I think it's a good starting point. There's a Facebook group called Transactive LDS that is a little bit more moderate. There's, you know, she could reach out to Mama Dragons. I know they're more focused on mothers, but I'm sure they would welcome a grandmother. And the great thing
I
about,
should probably clarify that she would be supportive if she could settle inside herself that a child that age could know. Does that make sense?
have her
That's
call
her
me.
biggest question.
Seriously, I love talking to parents. And so that's something that if she really wants to talk to somebody, I see a lot of times with the parents as well. The fear is, what is going to happen to this kid? Right? You look at the way trans people are portrayed in media. We're serial killers. We're the butt of jokes. We are the comic relief. We are meant to be rejected. We're liars. You know, people are justified in getting violent when they find out that we're trans. that's how we're portrayed in media. And so a lot of the parents or relatives, when they see a child come out as trans, they think, well, they're going to be a social pariah. And yeah, if you make them one. But, most people in my personal and professional life wouldn't know I was trans unless I said I am. And I stay visible for those parents who need to be able to see that, hey, you can be trans and grow up to be happy and successful and healthy. And, even um, as conservative as Utah is, and I work in the legal field, which is an incredibly conservative profession. And for the most part, I have found nothing but acceptance among my peers. And there's a few that have been problematic, and I have had to ask the court to censure certain people from time to time. But it hasn't been an issue. And so, especially when they're getting support from their family, trans kids don't need to worry about this as much. And if you're starting young and before puberty, nobody's going to know. Nobody that you don't tell is going to know. And so, if a lot of her concerns are the social repercussions, they just, unless somebody's being a jerk and outing them, no one's going to know. But again, I'm happy to talk to your friend um, if you think that would be helpful. But yes, I knew that I knew by the time I was 4 or 5, it just wasn't safe.
Okay.
So that's not too early.
Well, I'll talk to her and see what she thinks.
Yeah, I'm
Thank you
tough. I
for
can
the
handle it. I've
okay.
heard worse things from my own family members. So if she needs somebody to vent to, she can vent to me. She can, mom and dragons are great. There's several of them.
Okay.
They're used to taking in new parents and seeing through the frustration and helping them learn to love their kid. And
Okay.
that's really what they specialize in, and supporting each other and being judgment free as people come to terms with this. And so those are some good resources for her.
Okay. Thank you.
So, does anyone else have some wrap-up questions here, comments? No. You can ask again if you have more questions. No? Okay. Okay. It looks like someone's typing one in chat, so we'll give them a second. And when I say them, I'm not intending to misgender you. I'm just keeping your anonymity. So just clarify that there. I'll give you a second to type that out. While I look at my notes and make sure I covered everything. While they're typing, does anyone else have a question? Real quick. I see people thinking. Trying to think if there's any other good anecdotes I can share here while we wait. Oh, there we go. Okay, so the question is, I'm working on an encyclopedia type book for LDS members and leadership to help them understand the LGBT community. I'm looking for transgender members or post members to contribute. Again, a great place to ask would be the Transactive LDS Facebook group or the Affirmation Trans Allies group. I'm sure you'll find tons of people willing to help participate there. I'm working myself on a bit of a story project that we want to start publishing somewhere as an essay series, for example. And those are great places to ask people for help. Well, then I will go ahead and wrap up. I wanted to share one story. This one is Samantha's story instead of somebody else's. I still live in the ward boundaries where I transitioned, and my neighbors have mostly. It's rare to have anyone actually interact with me. Um, at best, I'm ignored. At worst, I have the Relief Society president and the bishop's wife will take their kids and go home when I bring mine to the playground. But I know that's not the prevailing attitude. People just aren't sure how to approach me necessarily, or afraid. This is a big one I see, are afraid to be seen talking with the sinner, right? And the answer to that, again, is, if you're calling yourself a Christian, what did Jesus do? He was often seen eating with the publicans and the tax collectors and, people who were seen as the outcasts of society. And so, when it's peer pressure that is the issue, you need to really think about who the person you worship, what he thought about peer pressure, which is he didn't care. So anyway, going back to my story, I've mostly been ignored by most of my neighbors, and even seeing my next door neighbors who I used to have a pretty good relationship with, it was a quick smile or the nod of the head or something was the most communication we had. And then one day my next door neighbor, just out of nowhere, actually walked over to talk to me. And asked me what my name was now. And we had a really brief conversation, mostly because I had to get away. I couldn't hold it together. And I literally, after just that simple conversation, wept for several hours because at least one person still saw me as a human being. And on that same note, it's the hardest part of the whole transition process is one that other people cause, and that's the loss of friends, the loss of relationships, and the loss of interaction. I recently bought a high-speed book scanner for a case I'm working on right now, and to practice with it, I was digitizing my old mission journals. And the loss that I, remembering these people who used to be a part of my life that want nothing to do with me now, people that I loved and thought loved me, and transition was enough to lose them from my lives forever. And some of them have them be willing to perjure themselves in trying to take my children away because it's not appropriate for children to be raised by a transgender parent. And, to contrast that with the people who say, well, if you're not welcome in your ward, come to mine. And if you can't go to Relief Society, I'm not going to Relief Society. And the people who say, I'll sit with you in the foyer if you can't go to class. The I don't understand what you're going through, but please come. We want you here. Leaders. That's what we need more of. And I hope that those who, I'm afraid I'm preaching to the choir, but that's what we need more of. That's what we need, is to love first, as Wade said early. That's really what determines the experience that transgender people have in their community, in their churches, is whether we choose to love the person or love the law, which again isn't even actually the rule. It isn't even actually doctrine. And I can cite sources for that if people want them, but it's not. And so I will go ahead and wrap up there if nobody has any other questions or comments. So thank you for coming. And again, you're all welcome to send me messages if you have questions or comments, concerns, things we can help with. I always love talking to parents or church leaders, and I can be gentle. I'm also capable of helping them screw their heads on straight when they need that. So again, thank you for coming.